Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, hi, I'm Bree. I live in Kansas Zone 7A, and today I am going to review the 2024 gardening year. This is typically a video I would be filming outside of my garden, but it's about 50 degrees today and quite windy, and that does not sound that nice to be sitting in. I am someone who loves warmth, and the moment it starts to get cold, all I want to do is be bundled up and indoors. So I'm just going to sit right here. We're going to review all things the 2024 garden. I have a handful of categories that I'm going to kind of break everything up in, but this is something I love to do at the end of the year. I've done this for a few years now, where I kind of just discuss the gardening year, the timeline of the year, how things went, things that disappointed me, and kind of everything in between. I'm gonna grab my notebook here. This has a bunch of different notes that I have written throughout the year. I'm sure I have lost track of a few things, but this is gonna just help me summarize everything up. So one thing I did want to start with is typically our first average frost around here is about that 3rd to 4th week of October. And our last frost is typically about that 3rd week of April. For me, I like to wait to plant any of my frost tender things out until that 1st week of May. With that being said, this was probably one of my best gardening years yet. This was year 7 for me, and honestly, I changed a few things up in the garden this year, and I really feel like it made such a difference. On top of that, we had a really just good weather year. We were warm and hot, but we weren't having extreme pockets of hot like we've had in previous years. And we were very lucky in that aspect. And we also were a little bit rainier, I feel like, or more consistent in rain in those beginning months. So categories today for this is what did I do differently in 2024? That will be our first one. Then I'm going to go into my seed starting and planting schedule and kind of how things went in and out of the garden. That way you can get a better idea of my timeline, especially if you are in a similar area to me. I'll give you all of my planting dates on that. And then I'm also going to talk about what did well, what didn't do well, what exceeded my expectations, what didn't. And then I'm going to jump into what I was able to kind of preserve out of the garden. I definitely do not have full numbers on this because we have ate through a handful of things, but I did at least list different things I was able to preserve. And then what would I do differently in 2025, and what am I going to do the same? So with that being said, let's jump into the first category, which is what did I do differently in 2024? The first 3 things on this list I really feel like made majority of the difference this year when it comes to the garden. So one of the first things I really did differently in the 2024 year is I was really trying to make sure I timed out my seedlings perfectly. This is something that's been very difficult for me over the years. I would get really close or do really well on a few things, and there'd be a few other things that either I started a little bit too early or too late. This year, I really feel like I got a really good sweet spot on almost everything. I really liked my seed starting schedule. I was starting about a handful of seeds about every week, every 2 weeks once February got here. I did start a few things earlier than that though, which we will discuss, but my seed starting schedule overall was significantly better this year. I didn't have any super large starts at all. Everything was really uniform, really beautiful. Like I had beautiful starts. And that kind of leads me into my second point, which is I was feeding my seedlings very early on. And I was also doing foliar feedings this year with fish and seaweed fertilizer. So I pretty much fed my seedlings with the fish and seaweed fertilizer only. And they looked so good. These were probably some of my best seed starts, like I just said. And then this year was the year I started to incorporate foliar feeds throughout my garden, which with the fish and seaweed fertilizer, you are able to use that every 10 to 14 days. And I was on a fertilizing schedule every 10 to 14 days pretty much since mid-February until about August. I got a little lazy in August, which I could have been a little bit better about, which I will probably make that as a note for next year. I just got a little bit lazy once like preserving got super crazy, but I was feeding my plants about every 10 to 14 days with fish and seaweed fertilizer. And I will say I also do soil testing, but that made such a huge difference in my garden. The foliar feeds especially, like I've never done foliar feeds before. In a foliar feed, your plant is able to absorb the nutrients through their leaves and not having to absorb it through the soil. So I don't know, I really enjoyed that. I think it made a huge difference. Another thing I did this year that made a really big difference, I feel, is a filter on my hose. This is something I have never done, but we got a filter for the hose. And if you did not know, most of the time your treated water has chlorine in it, and chlorine can actually kill the microorganisms in the soil. And the filter can also remove heavy metals and things like that could end up in your garden. And I feel like my plants overall this year were just significantly healthier. I will know a little bit more next year because I'm planning on doing both those things again. Every gardening year is different. So I'll be really interested to see how this continues on. But those two things I feel like just made a huge difference in my garden this year. My garden was it was just thriving. The other thing I really decided to do this year was try to cut back on how much I was cramming things into spaces. I obviously don't have a small garden, but I also don't have a large garden. I am limited in what I can grow. And in years past, I was trying to fit as much as possible, and I was really going toward the small, like end scale when it comes to spacing. Like say something needed about 8 to 12 inches, I was planting it 8 inches and not really giving it any row space either. So then I felt like I was having more disease problems because I wasn't having enough airflow just because everything was so packed in. So this year I made a very cautious effort to kind of just space things a little bit better, or row space things a little bit better. And one thing I did, especially with the garlic and the onions, is this was the first year I planted 8 inches apart for the garlic. And then with the onions, I did 8 inches apart with 10-inch rows. And I had such beautiful harvests of garlic and onions, very uniform, very large. So I think that also made a really big role, just because you're also not fighting for nutrients when things are a little bit more spaced out. A few other things I did differently this year was I potted up my extra seed starts. So I actually started out, I think like 6 or 7 extra pepper plants, for example. And this was just because I like to plant out a few extras in case a few of my starts don't look good. I can be a little bit choosy on what gets planted in my garden. But this year I was like, you know what? I'm gonna pot these up after I got done planting out the garden in May. I potted up all of my extra plants and I kept them under my seed starting lights. And I really liked that because what happened was I harvested my garlic, for example. I typically am able to harvest my garlic that second week of June. And once all of that stuff came out of the garden, I was actually able to plant a second round of peppers, and those peppers gave me a good amount of peppers. And I started those peppers in February, so I did up pot them to a 5-6 inch pot after May, and it did really well. So that is something I'm definitely going to do again. Another thing kind of on that note, as far as like another thing with like seed starting, is if you're like with onion seedlings, I have started them all different kinds of ways. I've cluster sowed them. I've done a few seeds per block and kind of separated them as I planted them out. This year, I was very tedious on planting 1 seed per soil block. That was game changer at planting because I wasn't spending so much extra time at planting, pulling plants apart. I also feel like since I wasn't pulling plants apart and disturbing the roots, even though onions have really strong roots, I wasn't disturbing root systems, and my onions were able to get established a lot quicker, which I think made a huge difference when we ended up having a really fluke cold snap, which we will also talk about in a little bit. But when it comes to planting onions, it's kind of like garlic. And if you've never done both, it's kind of tedious. You are planting out a ton of different holes, but with onions, you also can't plant them too deep. You have to be really cautious of how much you're planting them down because that's going to affect their bulbs, especially with like their roots and stuff. So it's just very tedious. So for me to be able to take out some of that extra time of really messing with the onion plants and just being able to plop a soil block into the soil, it was a game changer, and I will forever be sowing my onions like that for now on. I overall just had better succession sowing. I feel like that just comes with being more knowledgeable in the garden. So another thing I did was I did a lot more preserving as I went. I didn't wait to do a huge tomato processing day at the very end. Typically I would freeze a bunch of my tomatoes and do it at the end. Still have some tomatoes in there, but I did my tomatoes throughout, which was a lot of work, but felt so good. And then last but not least, I did pole beans. I have to say, I love this so much. There's a few different reasons for that as well. So I love my trellises. And one thing is green beans grow very, very quickly. So my trellises this year were just a lot fuller, a lot quicker because the green beans grew so quick and the trellis got filled up a lot faster, which I loved because my trellis space also gives me a lot of privacy amongst neighbors in the backyard there. So that was just something I really loved. The other thing I really liked is I was able to get my first wave of green beans in. So if you didn't know, green beans are a little bit finicky with heat and extreme sun. And this is something I've had issues with trying to plant them out midsummer. Even though green beans are a really quick crop, I've noticed for me, they do better in the fall and in the spring. And with the pole variety, you can keep them in. Like I planted out my pole bean seeds, I want to say it was either, I think I have it written down here somewhere, May 1st, May 2nd. And those lived in my garden up until about a week ago or so when I ripped them out. And what happened was I got really good harvest for like the end of June into July. Things slowed down through August, like end of July into August. And then when September hit again and we kind of cooled back down a little bit, I was able to get a whole separate second like wave of green beans to where I have a good amount of green beans in the freezer. Really enjoy that because I've done a lot of bush beans in the past and they also just take up a lot of space. So maybe I've been converted and I will be growing pole beans for now on. Okay, so I typically get a lot of questions when it comes to my seed starting timeline, when I'm planting things out, when I'm harvesting things out. So I went through and I made sure I had dates for a lot of different things. This might be like one of those things that might be kind of boring, so feel free to skip ahead, but I find things like this to be interesting, especially as someone who really didn't know much about gardening. At least this way you can get a better visual for my timeline. So the very first things for the 2024 garden that went into the ground was actually October 28th of 2023, and that is when I planted my garlic. After that, I started my onion seeds December 31st of 2023 inside under my lights. I grew a variety called Calibra this year, which is a variety I also grew last year. I really like that variety a lot. And then we pretty much skipped the entire month of January, which I do feel like this next year I'll probably plant my sweet potatoes in January. I might like bump them up a week or two. But as of February 8th of 2024, I got more seeds started with broccoli, cabbage, kale, collards, lettuce, rosemary, lavender, and I also started my sweet potatoes that week as well. And then the following week on February 13th, I started all of my peppers. So this year I had 8 different varieties and I really wanted to make a note of this. So last year I was very much disappointed in the cayenne variety I grew. I grew a variety called Red Rocket last year and it was very thin walled and really hard to work with, especially to de-seed to make any type of cayenne powder. So this year I was on the lookout for more of a thicker walled cayenne and I loved the variety I grew so much this year. It was a hybrid from Johnny's called Red Ember, and the flesh on it is pretty much just as thick as I would say about like a jalapeno. It's very similar to the paprika peppers that I grow, the Hungarian Magars, which we'll go ahead and cross that off the list. I really enjoyed them. They dried beautifully. The walls were thicker, very easy to de-seed. I will definitely be growing those again. I grew classic jalapenos, classic banana peppers. I do not remember my bell pepper variety. I need to try to figure that out because those actually did really well for me this year. I also did a snacking pepper this year, which is a hybrid from Johnny's as well, and I really liked these. You know that variety bag you can get at the grocery store that has yellow, orange, and red little peppers that you can snack on? That's what I grew. So I did buy a variety pack, but I apparently only grew orange ones for some reason. I was a little disappointed on that, but they made the most beautiful powder as well. I freeze dried a bunch at the very end and I love this powder so much. I've been tossing it into rice to make seasoned rice and it's so good and the color on it's so beautiful. So I really liked those. I'll probably be growing those again. I grew classic serranos and then poblanos, which we'll talk about in a little bit. On February 21st, 2024, I planted my snapdragons. March 4th of 2024, my onions and poppies were planted in the garden. This is right around 6 weeks before my average last frost, but I really like the 6 weeks out from my average frost for onions. I've done this the last 2 years and really liked it. Poppies did really well being planted. They kind of need that cold stratification. So really liked that. They got planted in the ground March 4th, which is pretty early as far as planting things in the ground. March 6th of 2024, I seed started some dahlias, hibiscus, and oregano down in my basement. On March 13th, we got loofah, basil, lemon basil, parsley, echinacea, all started inside. And then I also direct sowed my spinach outside, and all of my cool weather crops got planted as well. So my broccoli got planted outside, my lettuce got planted outside, cabbage, kale, collards, they all got planted March 13th. So on March 20th, my tomatoes got started. I started a second round of lettuce, and then I also started mint and hyssop. So this year I planted my tomatoes roughly 5 weeks out before they were getting planted in the ground. And I have to say, I really feel like that was a sweet spot. They really weren't too big, and I really enjoy that. Tomatoes can be one of those things when you're seed starting that honestly can kind of be a pain, especially if you start them just slightly too early. Tomatoes grow so fast. For example, I started my peppers February 13th, and I did not start my tomatoes until 5 weeks after I started my peppers. And they were the same height when they all got planted. And then on March 25th and 26th, we actually had a really significant hard freeze, which is a little bit later for us. We have had cold dips like this that very first week of March, which is one of those things I keep an eye on when I'm planting out my onions, but I've never experienced the cold snap we had March 25th and 26th. We were in the 20 degrees for over 12 hours. We were having feel likes in the teens. And with this multiple hard freeze, I mean, we had garlic already growing pretty significantly at that point. Onions were in the ground, broccoli, lettuce, my blueberries and my strawberries, they were already blooming, which also was a smidge early because we were having such warm temperatures. I was looking back at footage for just making notes for this video, and I was wearing shorts and a t-shirt, I think the week prior of this super, super cold snap we got. So I covered everything with frost fabric, even my garlic, which I typically wouldn't have done, but we ended up having ice and sleet at the very front of this cold snap. It wasn't like it was just a cold snap. We also had a lot of moisture, and I didn't want anything to get ice or frost damage that way, especially with the garlic already growing so significantly at that point. And I ended up having some damage, even with having the frost fabric, because some of the frost fabric ended up blowing up because it was super windy, and my onions got really damaged. And I think this was probably the start of just the onions probably not doing as well as I actually thought they did, which we will discuss as well. That cold snap, it damaged a few things. Everything did fairly well though. Like I lost a few leaves on the broccoli and the lettuce, but everything snapped back and it was completely fine. So I did truly learn how much things can handle. I feel like if my frost fabric didn't fly off the onions, I probably wouldn't have had so much damage on those. But I did learn how much plants can take. I might try to plant out like a few like extra greens or something just as an experiment, because we have had like warmer, you watch this year will be like the cold year, then like the snowy year. On March 28th, I planted carrots outside, and then I really didn't plant out anything else until April 25th, which was about a week before I planted everything else out. I just planted out my snapdragons and dahlias. And then all of my frost tender stuff got planted out on May 1st and May 2nd. So I also direct sowed things like green beans this day, honeydew this day, cantaloupe this day. Did I direct sow anything else? I feel like I direct sowed sunflowers. At the end of May 28th, all of my broccoli got harvested. It was so beautiful this year. I've been planting a variety called Bell Star, and I really like it because it's more stress resistant, and we have very crazy fluctuating temperatures here, where one day it can be pretty cold, the next day it's significantly warm, and those ups and downs can really play with broccoli. I've had a lot of issues in the past with a lot of broccoli varieties, but the Bell Star has proven to be wonderful for me. I planted out my sweet potato slips on May 31st. I really held back on those because sweet potatoes don't like cold whatsoever. And then on June 7th, my garlic was harvested. This was my best garlic harvest yet, I have to say. Such beautiful heads of garlic. They were gorgeous. And again, this is where those foliar feeds really come into play. This was the year I decided to do foliar feeds, mostly for the garlic. And I just decided to start doing it with a lot of the stuff, and beautiful garlic, so good. June 10th and 12th, after I got all of that garlic harvested, corn, okra, and zucchini, and also those peppers I mentioned, all went and got planted in place of where that garlic is. So that can kind of show you how I'm getting multiple waves of stuff out of these beds. The garlic was done for me beginning of summer. And then that corn, ooh, that corn was so good. This was also the first year I was really successful with corn. And that was great timing. I really liked timing that with the okra and the corn. I'll probably be doing that again next year. And then let's see, mid-June, I was starting to harvest my carrots at that point. I had really beautiful carrots again this year too. June 28th of 2024, I was actually starting more cool weather crops already. And those are the ones that are planted in my garden right now. So all the broccoli, cabbage, collards, kale I have outside right now, I started at the very end of June. And that timing worked out a lot better. I ended up trying to research that a little bit better this year and time that out better for a fall garden. I've had some issues in the past, like just getting overwhelmed with summer and not starting my fall crops in time. And then I ended up finding kind of a chart on my extension website, my ag extension, that broke down the timelines on a fall garden a little bit better for my area. And that really helped with my seed starts. On July 5th, all of my onions got harvested, and I have to say these onions were beautiful. They were the best onions I ever grew. And if you know, you know. They were so beautiful. We'll talk about that in a second. The end of July, I started harvesting all of my melons. I will say I absolutely hated my honeydew variety. I was really excited about honeydew this year. I really need to look up the variety I grew. I think it was called sweet something. I don't know. I hated them. So in 2023, I grew watermelon, and watermelon's also very tricky. So there's melons that slip and there's melons that don't slip. And all that means is they naturally slip off the vine, which cantaloupe naturally slips off the vine. I love growing cantaloupe. It's so beginner friendly. If you're trying to find a melon, find a cantaloupe variety. My favorite is Hal's Jumbo or Hale's Jumbo, however you want to pronounce it. I hated the honeydew variety. I did have someone comment on one of my videos that Johnny's has a hybrid honeydew that naturally slips that I might try. But for me, being in a smaller space like I am, if I'm not going to be, I don't know, maybe I just need to research picking it more, but like even with watermelon, they were just so tricky because there's tricks with the tendril you can watch, color changes you can watch, and I don't know. The honeydew was just not the texture I really enjoyed. Like the cantaloupe has such a beautiful texture. I don't know. I just really was not a fan, and honeydew's always been my favorite melon, so very disappointed with that. In August, see, I told you, you would find out pretty quick. So 4 weeks after I harvested my beautiful onion crop, I lost my entire onion crop for the most part. I think I was able to get like 20 to 30 onions. But what happened was I cured them the same way I've cured onions in the past. And I ended up going outside. I was using these onions throughout the time span of them curing in my garage. And week 3, no issue. And then week 4, I was going to start cleaning them up to put them down in the basement, and I noticed black mold. And then within inspecting everything further, pretty much the rest of my harvest got knocked out by this black mold. I'm telling you, like, there was so much black mold in these onions, which was so disappointing because these onions were so big and beautiful. And the thing I ended up figuring out that was probably the issue. I had a lot of people say that they had similar issues to me in Kansas. So we had a ton of wind damage, and that's something I will talk about in a little bit. So we had a lot of wind. I had a lot of green breakage, and when that can happen, like things can get in that you don't want them to get in. and things don't really show up until you start curing and things, I don't know. It was really disappointing. Unfortunately, I feel like I'm gonna have a little bit anxiety going into the onion harvest this next year, and maybe I just need to do a few things differently. One of the things I'll talk about is my plan to do things differently. I don't really know what I'm gonna do quite yet, but I did end up losing my entire onion harvest, which was devastating. It was one of the things this year that didn't do well. This year was overall an amazing gardening year, but that was a really bummer loss. So also beginning of August, I started harvesting loofah. I planted out my fall crops the first week of August. So my fall crops were only inside for about 5 weeks or so. And then I harvested my sweet potatoes on September 27th. And obviously throughout like the entirety of summer, I was harvesting a ton of tomatoes. I was harvesting a ton of peppers. Those things that you're constantly harvesting, I was harvesting throughout the summer. And then I planted out my garlic on Halloween this year, which is a little bit later than last year. Speaking of some of the timeline things, I kind of got into some of this already, but what did well, what didn't do well? So let's talk about things that didn't do well first, which elderberry. This was my second year for elderberry and I was very disappointed. They did put on berries. So I have 2 separate elderberry plants. They are supposed to cross-pollinate each other. And I did get berries this year, but I didn't get a lot of berries. They really didn't bloom that much. So I don't really know. I don't know. I got to research that one more. So my cabbage and my collards. So the cabbage I have out there right now, I feel like is rebounding quite well. The cabbage I grew in the spring, I didn't even plant out. I don't know what was going on. So typically if my seed starts don't look that great, I just don't plant them out. And I want to say I planted like 8 to 10 cabbage plants and there was not one that looked worth planting. So I just did not plant them in the spring. As far as collards go, those just mostly got attacked by cabbage moss. I don't know what it is, but they really like collards for some reason. And I just have found those to be a little bit trickier in the space. I feel like one thing I need to do a little bit differently, which I keep just going on to like extra topics, but I need to reset up an area where I just have insect netting up because I had that in my garden years ago and it made a huge difference. And the last thing that really didn't do well were my poblanos. They did well, but I hated the variety I grew. I don't know what it was. The flavor was not good. They were small. I did not enjoy them at all. I honestly didn't really do much with them at all. I did try to powder them down. I tried to make a sauce with them. I didn't like anything I did with them. I did not like them. All right, what did well? Honestly, almost everything did pretty decently this year, which again, I had one of my best years. So I can't complain about anything. It was my best tomato year, my best garlic year. So those 2 things made me super happy. One of those weeks I processed over 100 pounds of tomatoes just in 1 week. And that wasn't anything else either, which was absolutely insane. My hibiscus ended up doing really good. I grew hibiscus this year for tea. I grew a variety called Zinger. And at first, when I was seed starting, my seed starts looked terrible. Like, I don't know what was going on. They were the one seed starts that were just like not doing it for me. They weren't doing well. They were yellow most of the time. They weren't green. And I was like, I have no idea what's going on with these. But I still planted them all out and they all did very well. So I don't know. That was a weird one at first, but the hibiscus ended up doing well. Corn. This was the first year I was successful with corn. So sweet corn has always been tricky. Sweet corn, you have to grow kind of like in a box because they all pollinate each other. And one thing I did in the past was I really didn't do that. I would plant them in a few rows, but that wasn't significant enough. Having them like in a whole bed like I did, I think really helped. I also hand pollinated them myself. I was feeding them quite often. Corn is a really heavy feeder and I was successful with corn. It tasted so good. I loved it so much. Okra was great this year. I think it's mostly because I planted it in one of my sunniest locations. In years past, I tried to stick it in wherever I could find. And honestly, I never had that great of an okra year, but this year I was able to get a decent amount pickled. I would have got more pickled, but then I couldn't find vinegar pretty much anywhere. And then cantaloupe, this was my best cantaloupe year yet. I did plant out more plants, but I had such beautiful cantaloupe. I was getting cantaloupe pretty much nonstop from July through October, and we pretty much had a minimum of about 3 to 4 a week. They were just coming. They tasted so good. Loved them so much. As far as what I was able to preserve out of the garden, obviously this is just what I was able to put back in my pantry. This isn't anything we ate fresh. I also don't have exact numbers, kind of like I mentioned in the beginning, but I honestly was able to put away all sorts of different things this year. I also still have one more round of tomatoes and garlic I need to process. I will be doing that next week. So these numbers aren't exact, but this is what I currently have downstairs. Like I said, I've already had out a good amount of salsa and crushed tomatoes. So as far as canned stuff, I was able to get tomato sauce. I really think I got a year's worth of salsa and probably a year's worth of crushed tomatoes down there. Very, very excited about those. I also was able to pickle okra, pickled peppers, jalapeno jelly. As far as like things I freeze dried, I have cantaloupe, carrots, peppers. I made it into different powders. I chopped them. I can easily toss them into things. With some of those onions, I was able to keep. I made onion powder. I also have some chopped onions, garlic powder, tons of herbs, garlic scapes chopped, strawberries. I also dried a ton of lavender and loofah. I freezed a bunch of broccoli and green beans. So this was the year I got a year's worth of a handful of things. I can honestly say I feel like I got a year's worth of these things. Paprika powder was definitely one, cayenne powder. I really think salsa, crushed tomatoes, we definitely did. We got pickled peppers, probably a year's worth of those. Honestly, we probably have a year's worth of carrots as well, which is really, really exciting. With this year being so abundant, I was able to put back significantly more than I have been in the past. And to be able to get that many jars of salsa alone, that has been a goal for a while, which makes me super, super happy. What do I plan to do differently in 2025? And what do I plan to do the same? So obviously one of the first things I really need to kind of figure out going into the 2025 year is what do I want to do as far as like a wind block solution for the onions. If you have any ideas for this, please let me know. I did think about potentially getting what they use for flowers as far as like the flower netting to where they can grow up, but then I worry that that wouldn't work so well when the onions start to flop over. I don't know if that would necessarily work. I just need to figure out a way where maybe I can block some of the wind gusts that my onions might get, because I want to try to prevent as much breakage as possible. It really wasn't such an issue in 2023 because we were significantly drier, and I really do feel like the rain made this more of a problem this year. If you have any ideas, please let me know. I would like to try to add at least one garden bed, maybe two. I really don't really have the room. I do have one area I could add one more garden bed, but I would have to remove my perennial area. I have a Viaro in Echinacea, and I don't know if I really want to do that, but I could get so much more with one more garden bed. So I don't know, that's kind of an up in the air thing. Definitely a new compost area. I'm currently trying to make my plans right now on a few things. I am gonna make the trellis tunnel a little bit longer. I did remove my front trellis that I had this year because that's where I planted out the garlic. So regardless, the trellis tunnel is gonna be longer. And I also might make it wrap. I don't know. I thought wrapping it kind of would give me a little bit more privacy as well. So I don't know. I'm playing around with a few ideas there. I would like to try to incorporate more insect netting and frost fabric just to make my life a little bit easier and maybe extend my garden a little bit. I would obviously love to have a greenhouse, but I don't know if that's something I'll really be able to manage in my current space. But I would like to at least try to challenge myself a little bit on extending my garden a little bit more or playing around with a few different like techniques with that. And then I'm also thinking I need to research some dwarf variety of fruit trees. So I was able to get some massive garden planters that I think would actually work pretty well for dwarf trees. So I'm thinking I really want to try to find a few that maybe I could plant this year. Strawberries. I ripped out all of my strawberries last week, and I have a lot of them planted in my basement under lights at the moment, and they're doing quite well. I saved a lot of my younger plants, but I want to reset my strawberries to where I don't know for sure if I really want to plant those out in any particular area. I don't know if I want to get new varieties. I'll probably plant those strawberries out anywhere regardless. I don't know. The strawberries are kind of up in the air. If you have a favorite variety, please leave that down below for me. My problem with the strawberries is I just haven't been able to grow as much as I would like, and I think that's just due to how much I'm able to actually grow. And then a few things I am going to do the same in 2025 is I'm going to continue to soil test. I think soil testing makes a huge difference because you don't want to add any nutrients that you don't need. I think pH plays a huge role. Again, you don't want to throw any nutrients in there that you don't need. So I think soil testing makes a huge difference. Even if you just do an at-home test, foliar feeds, I really am going to keep up on the foliar feeds, and I'm also going to keep up with the fish and seaweed fertilizer. I really liked that. And then I'm also going to keep the filter on my hose. But guys, that kind of breaks down the garden in a whole for 2024. It was a great year for me, and I don't really have complaints outside of losing my onion harvest. That was honestly quite devastating, but such a learning curve as well. Overall though, I am very happy with how this year went. I hope you guys enjoyed following along. Thank you guys so much for being here as we reviewed the 2024 year. I will see you guys all in the next one. Bye.